Hey everyone, welcome to session 136 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Dr. Kim Berens joins me again for a third time to discuss her new book, Blind Spots: Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. In this show, we talk about her motivation to write this book, what she believes is wrong with the current approach to educating children in the United States, and what can be done to remedy the situation. And boy, do we get into all sorts of other topics as well in the general area of education. This is a fascinating interview that I hope you enjoy as much as I did. Like our recent episode with Amelia Bowler earlier this month, this is another great example of people trained in behavior analysis rhetorically stepping out of our comfortable profession and speaking directly to a broader community. And I can't think of a community more important than the stakeholders involved with educating children. In short, it's an excellent model of dissemination, and this book should be applauded for this reason, along with all the other excellent attributes it has. Before the book's publication, I was honored to be asked by Kim to write a blurb for the book, and I'll share it here. Don't worry, it's really brief. In 1984, B.F. Skinner wrote The Shame of American Education, in which he described how the American educational system failed to incorporate scientifically validated instructional practices. Sadly, this paper is just as relevant after almost 4 decades since its publication. In Blind Spots: Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them, Dr. Kimberly Berens courageously picks up where Skinner left off by shining a light on the dysfunctional practices of the American educational establishment. In doing so, she debunks many popular myths that currently pervade educational practices. More importantly, Dr. Berens offers concrete solutions for helping all students learn through the application of the natural science of behavior. This is a book that should be read by every parent, school board member, administrator, and teacher. All right, that's the end of the blurb. And I could go on and on about this book as well as the interview I'm about to play, but instead, I'll just ask you to give the show a listen. And if you're so moved, to pick up a copy of the book, or better yet, gift a copy of the book if you happen to know a teacher, a school administrator, a school board member, and so on. So this is a show where the show notes will be especially helpful, so you want to head over to behavioralobservations.com and look for session 136 to find links to the various podcasts, books, and so forth that were discussed in this interview. And while I'm on the topic of show notes, if you'd like them delivered directly to your email inbox, sign up for the email list while you're over at behavioralobservations.com. I only send out a handful of emails a month as I know what it's like to be pelted with inbound correspondence. All right, today's episode was brought to you with generous support from the Market Your ABA Practice Like a Pro, a digital masterclass with Rich Brooks. Is your ABA practice located in a competitive area? Do you struggle with name recognition and visibility among autism service providers in your community? Do you wish more parents and stakeholders knew about the awesome services you provide? Well, during this event, you'll discover marketing strategies that will allow you to get your ABA practice in front of ideal community stakeholders. By using the digital tools that everyone's being forced to use these days, this can help draw new clients, families, and schools, and even employees to your agency. The price of the event is $149, but if you register by Halloween, you can attend it for just $99. And that's over at the show notes for this episode over at behavioralobservations.com if you want to learn more. We're also brought to you by the Whoop Strap. If you've been following my Instagram account, which is over at Behavioral Observations, you'll notice that I've posted some pictures of my Whoop Strap readings. I've only had it for a few short weeks, but boy, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed having it. I get all this great quantitative information on all aspects of my health, including sleep analytics, heart rate, along with heart rate variability, calorie burn, exercise intensity, and Whoop's proprietary strain score. I could extol this neat device's virtues indefinitely to you, but instead you can go check it out for yourself. And while you're at it, get the first month free. To learn more, head over to behavioralobservations.com/whoop. That's behavioralobservations.com/whoop. That's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with Dr. Kim Berens.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, Dr. Kimberly Berens, now we've got those technical difficulties hopefully in our rearview mirror. Thank you for coming back again for the third time on the Behavioral Observations podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again.
My pleasure. You know, when we met the last time, it was at the Tate Behavioral Conference in Springfield, Mass, where we did a live interview. And at the time, you were talking about this project you were working on, and we knew it was a book. I don't think the title was available yet, or it was in some process of vetting, or maybe some process of development. And here we are a year later. The book is not only do you have a title for the book, but the book is coming out. It'll either, depending on when this podcast gets published, it'll either already been out or it'll be coming out shortly. So let's just start the show off. Tell me a little bit about that. So what is the book called, first of all?
Right. Well, it's called Blind Spots, Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. And it is coming out October 27th. And so when you mentioned a year ago, that's so crazy to me because what a year, right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. What an understatement.
I mean, little did I know when I was, working on the book that we'd also all of a sudden be in a global pandemic and all these other things will have happened. So it's been quite a year, but yes, so there is a book. It's one of the I will say the fact that it's already out and, coming out in print on October 27th is pretty remarkable. I hooked up with a Dynamo publisher. I mean, that's kind of unheard of in the book publishing world, which is awesome. So I didn't want to wait around for 3 years for that to come out. It's a pressing issue, especially now. I had no idea how relevant it would be actually with the educational crisis getting, even, worsening as a result of COVID. So it's, I'm very pleased at the timeline on that.
Well, congratulations. It's kind of probably akin to, having a child of in some respects of, this thing you put so much time and attention and care into, and now it's kind of out there in the world. So, again, congratulations. So, I heard you recently on my my friend's podcast, the Controversial Exchange, chatting with Dimitri and company, and you talked about writing this book out of frustration. So I'm always curious when people write books about their motivation to do so. So I want to give you the opportunity to kind of fill in those blanks a little bit. What were you frustrated at? And at the same time, I'd like you to talk about who's the intended audience for this book too.
Great. So that's absolutely true. Inside of kind of my motivation behind writing the book. And as you know, and your listeners most likely know because I've been on this podcast before, but I've been working in mainstream education for more than 20 years. I founded Fit Learning in 1998. So I've had a long career of interacting with parents and working on the front lines with learners who have been tragically failed by the educational system. And I mean, even though, we've worked with thousands and thousands of kids at this point, because Fit Learning has grown immensely, that's still a pinpoint of the number of kids that are actually being negatively affected by how tragically ineffective our educational system is. And so, there came a point where I had, attended, just one more IEP meeting where, no effective action was possible inside of that meeting because of the belief systems of, traditional educators. And then I'd had one more conversation with a parent who'd been, sold down the river about, their child having some mythological learning disability as an explanation for why they weren't reading or doing mathematics or able to write, express their ideas in written form. And, there comes a point where you just say to yourself, enough is enough already. I mean, not to say that I'm not so amazingly proud of Fit Learning and the impact we've made on children and and beyond that, the fact that we've evolved a replicable model of instruction based in behavioral science that is the most effective instructional method on the planet. I mean, we produce outcomes that no one believes are possible with kids every single day. So I'm really proud of that. But there came a point where I was like, I can't just be talking to one parent at a time anymore. And I can't be trying to move one IEP team at a time anymore. Like it is time for a paradigm shift in our culture And I really believe that the first step in producing that type of a shift is creating a distinction for the public around what their blind spots are, which is why I wrote why I came up with that title for the book, because a lot of people don't know what they don't know about why education's ineffective, about how it's always been that way since the dawn of compulsory education in America, and how there are many establishments in this country that promulgate those, belief systems that guarantee that our educational system remains ineffective and never evolves. And so inside of that, it was anger and frustration, I will tell you, that served as a motivating force, which is why I wrote the book literally in a couple months. I mean, I spend a long time doing research, and it's basically my 20, look, it's a marathon, right? I mean, this book represents 20 years of work direct. And also, I'm not an academic sitting in a glass tower here. I mean, I am in the chair working with kids still. I am actually doing the applied science myself, along with a huge team of amazing humans. But so, it did stem from frustration and anger at just the vicious cycle of failure that we are in as a culture. And the fact that, I serve a very specific demographic of families that can afford to supplement their children's education. But what makes me feel physically sick on a daily basis are the children in low-income areas that cannot access this kind of thing. And their quality of life is tragically poor. And the income inequality in our country is guaranteed to never improve because those children cannot access an effective education, which means they can't access higher education, which means they can't access well-paying, rewarding careers. And that is a tragedy. And it's a crime of our democracy. And so I said, it's time for me to stop talking to one person at a time. It's time to stop talking to my peers in behavior analysis who actually get this. It's time to start talking to the public and creating some distinctions so that power comes from that. Power comes from that sudden realization that, that lightning bolt that hits you in the face when you realize something that you never knew you didn't know. That's the dangerous place to be in. It's a safe place when when you're aware of what you don't know. Like when I know astrophysics exists, but I have no idea what that entails, but I know it exists, right? The dangerous place is when you don't know what you do not know. So you have no power to make a choice about a different course of action. And that power comes from that awareness. And so I really wrote the book to create an awareness for all stakeholders in American education: parents, teachers, policymakers, academics, and people from other fields, scientists from other fields, create an awareness that this exists, that behavioral science is the science of learning. And for decades upon decades, we have been demonstrating the power of applying our science to instruction. And that has been, number one, ignored, and number two, discounted by individuals who are aware of us, erroneously discounted because of systemic belief systems in our country that dominate education. So the book was really to bring awareness to the public about an alternative explanation for why so many students fail, and that's an overwhelming majority of American students. More than 60% are below proficiency, and that increases to more than 80% for children of color and those living in poverty. That is a tragedy and a crisis that has to be addressed, especially in light of all of the things we are facing: the global pandemic, climate change, political unrest, civil unrest. All of that is remedied with effective education. And until we address it, I believe we are stuck as a society. So that was my goal in writing the book.
I see.
Sorry.
All right. Wait. Okay. And we're off.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So one of the things I want to address right away is that I could see someone looking at the title of your book, or maybe taking some of your comments out of context, perhaps, and thinking that you're kind of crapping on teachers. But
right.
having previewed the book myself, I know that you go out of your way to and are very compassionate towards the plight of teachers. I was wondering if you could spend a minute talking about that and why they're in the situation they're in.
Right. Well, and I will absolutely say I am 100% pro teacher. As I state in my book, teachers are among the greatest humanitarians on earth, similar to healthcare workers, frontline workers. Teachers don't go into the profession for fame and fortune. It's not a selfish motivation when you enter the teaching profession. You enter the teaching profession with the desire to make a difference. And what just, in the same vein as feeling sickened by the thought of the number of children who are failed on a daily basis by schools, it sickens me to when I consider teachers who invest money in training, to attend teacher training programs, colleges of education, and they come out of those programs without the skill set required to be effective. And so teachers are sold down the river. And then what happens when they enter classrooms and encounter, the inevitable result of not being trained in the science of learning, the only option is to assume something's wrong with their students when they struggle. And on the other side, the only option for parents and people, stakeholders in American education, is to categorize teachers as good or bad teachers. So it all becomes this inherent kind of mythological explanation for failure. Students fail because they have inherent learning problems. Teachers fail because they're just not good at it. They just don't have talent. Neither of those explanations provide any action to make a difference, to make a change. And so teachers are helpless and learners are helpless. And none of it has anything to do with people being good or bad, smart or dumb, talented or not talented. It has everything to do with a lack of effective training. And the fact that teachers are not provided with competency in understanding how learning actually works, how instruction can be designed to facilitate mastery of fundamental skills. And they're also not given the freedom to behave like scientists in their classroom. And not only do they not have the knowledge or training on how to adjust instruction effectively for the learner, which requires a understanding of the learning process, but it's that even if they do have that training, they're not given the ability to do it because they have to follow timelines and rules. And they're operating under a system that provides them no freedom to be effective. And then they're held accountable for that with the whole standardized testing movement. And it said they should be paid based on merit, but none of that works if we haven't adequately provided teachers with the training they need to be effective. So I am 100% pro teacher, and I wrote this book primarily for teachers because teachers need to get together and protest. Teachers need to get together and demand that they are trained effectively, that they are empowered to be the experts in the room, and not have school boards and politicians telling teachers what they need to do in their classrooms. That would be as ridiculous as having a politician tell a medical doctor how they should treat their patients. The entire system has to change, but it starts with how teachers are trained so that they have the skill set required to be effective and then they're also given the power to implement their skill set and behave more like scientists in their classrooms. So I am 100% pro teacher.
Hi, my name's Rich Brooks, and you may recognize my name or my voice from Matt Sikoria's Behavioral Observation podcast. I've been on a few times talking about how ABA practices can better market their business. And apparently there's been a lot of interest in this, so Matt and I are getting together and we've created a digital masterclass for you if you're responsible for generating more leads for your ABA practice. Now this is going to be a live event. It's going to be done via Zoom like everything else these days. It's going to be on Monday, November 9th. It starts at 5 p.m., ends at 6:30. And during that time, I'm going to answer all your digital marketing questions. Maybe you're wondering why you're not ranking as well as you'd like to be at Google. Or maybe you're wondering how you can use social media to get in front of the decision makers. Or maybe you're wondering how and even why you should be building your email list. Or you want to know what you can do on your website to turn prospects into customers and clients, people who reach out and ask for your help. If any of this sounds like the kind of thing that's going to make a difference in your business, please go to takeflight.com/ABA Masterclass and register there. You can learn more there too. Again, it's takeflight.com/ABA Masterclass. The information's there. You can register. 90 minutes, an incredible amount of information, co-hosted between me and Matt. It is only $149. And if you register by Halloween, October 31st, it's actually only $99. So there's an early bird discount that lasts through the end of October. So do not wait. Don't hesitate. Grab your space and you will be in a much better position to succeed in 2021. I'll see you there.
So one of the things I'm thinking about is that in these teacher training programs at colleges and universities and things like that, seems like behavior analysis does not have a seat at the table in many respects. And so, which circles back to your point of teachers not getting necessarily adequate training or training in the way in which we think would be most optimal. In researching this book, did you look at the training programs and perhaps what it seems like behavior analysis maybe has lost the battle of ideas, if you will, in academia in terms of the colleges of ed. And I'm not sure if that's an accurate description or not, but why do you think some other teacher training programs have gotten more representation in various colleges and universities, and therefore has led to the workforce that we have these days, whereas behavior analysis hasn't? And also, I think just in my own kind of anecdotal observations, there seems to be this kind of curriculum industrial complex as well of publishers who want to sell books and curricula and things like that too, that probably interacts with all this. So it's just kind of like this terrible nexus of like bad science or pseudoscience plus potential quasi corrupt activity with the interaction of selling a large school. If you sell like the Manchester, New Hampshire school district or the Portland, Maine school district, or or a larger city on a particular curriculum, that's a pretty good sales quarter for fill in the blank publisher, right?
Yeah. So I absolutely did. I mean, that was a majority of my research, to be honest, was I studied the history of our public education system, kind of where it came from and how it evolved. And inside of that absolutely relates to the rise of teacher training programs that, were originally really trade schools, and they were called normal schools. It was almost like a vocational training program initially, and then those schools eventually became kind of they became housed inside of already existing liberal arts institutions. But the normal schools became evolved as separate entities, like I said, like trade schools that weren't related to universities. So I absolutely did a lot of research on teacher training, and to be quite honest, teacher training evolved in the same way that our school system evolved more generally, which was that it evolved as an ideological institution. And so what I mean by that is education has been and continues to be based on belief systems. So it did not evolve as a scientific institution or a pragmatic one, right? Where methods are tested in a scientific way, and the effects of those methods evaluated with respect to objective outcomes produced, and then methods evolved and modified based on that science. That's just not how the educational establishment evolved. Our educational establishment evolved based really on pressure by our greater culture with respect to what education should entail. So it was really built on people's opinions. The opinions of politicians, where politicians believed that education was the access to producing responsible members of a democracy. The beliefs of the workforce, leaders in industry who believed that education was a way to produce people who could effectively participate in the workforce and improve the economy. Back then when it was evolving, farmers and people in agriculture had a huge influence on education. And, they believed that that education should serve the agricultural industry and ensure that our farming industry continued. And then you had, people who were more interested in religion and values and they felt that, education should serve as the platform from which, the values were instilled in our kids. And then, then the homemaker became an issue so vocational training became a part of schools and domestic arts became a part of schools. So it was basically a hodgepodge of people's opinions and kind of the beliefs about what education should entail. And then the litmus test wasn't about whether or not those beliefs produced effective education of kids. The litmus test was whether or not teaching practices cohered with what people believed they should be. So that is how it always is in ideological institutions. Ideological institutions are always about coherence. They're always about what people doing aligning with what we believe they should be doing, which is absolutely the opposite of what occurs in science, which is science is about, producing, using the scientific method to produce a particular result and evaluating that result with respect to whatever the goals of the study were and determining whether or not that method produced that result. And if it didn't, modifying things and evaluating again. And even if it did produce a result, modifying and evaluating whether or not that result could get even better. So that's how our medical institutions have evolved. So in medicine has evolved as a pragmatic institution, which is why we have made unbelievable advances in medicine, because medicine is not ideological in that sense. Now, ideology can become a part of medicine when they try to delve into areas that they have no business delving into, like behavior and learning. Ideology shows way up in the medical establishment when that happens. But when it comes to basic diseases and health, medicine is massively evolved, as we all know. I mean, we all have benefited from that science. So there's a clear difference inside of an ideological institution and one that's based in science and pragmatism. And so as a result, ideological institutions are notoriously intractable. If you look at our political system, we're having the same arguments and the same debates as we've been having for centuries.
Yeah.
And if you look at, religious institutions, and again, there's nothing wrong with belief-based systems. There's nothing wrong with belief. And I really try to make this point in my book, and I hope I have. I'm also not anti-religion. I'm not, saying that no one should have a faith. I'm saying that we need as a culture to agree when belief we need to draw a line in the sand where belief stops being effective. And I think that the access to that is we need to consider aspects of our culture where effectiveness really matters, where outcomes really matter. And we need to decide that's when beliefs need to end and science needs to take over. And we've done that with medicine, because medicine was also faith-based back in the Middle Ages. I mean, it was all based on belief systems, and most people died from the practices being used, but the death of patients didn't matter because what doctors were doing matched the beliefs of the culture. So the outcomes weren't what was important to them. It was that doctors were doing what people believed they should be. But that changed because guess what? Human life matters to people, and we value living. We value survival. And so those values took over and science won the day. But that's never occurred in our educational system. And so I'm not saying religious institutions don't serve a purpose in our culture, but when you're dealing with matters of effectiveness or outcome, belief doesn't work. And that's been demonstrated throughout the history of our civilization. So we have to say it's time for belief to stop being the guiding force and not being our litmus test, and science needs to be. And unfortunately, that's never occurred. And so that's how teachers continue to be trained. That's how our schools continue to be designed. And that's why we have never produced a majority of effectively educated students in America. Not once, never. Not since the dawn of our education system has a majority of children been effectively educated, because our educational system has never evolved past ideology.
Hey there, I just want to take a quick break and remind you, or if you didn't hear it at the beginning, to talk a little bit about the Whoop strap. This will just take a second here. I've been using it for a few weeks now, and I really love it. It's amazing the amount of analytics you can get on your own kind of personal health data. So if you are interested in optimizing your sleep or maybe some exercise routines, we've been talking about fitness a lot on several of the recent episodes. This would be a perfect accompaniment to that. It can track all sorts of things like your heart rate, your calories burned, your heart rate variability. It has this kind of proprietary strain score, which can give you some guidance as to whether to push it or whether to take it easy. You can see the effect of all sorts of things on your sleep. So if you go out with your friends and maybe make a few poor decisions, you can definitely see quantitatively how that affects how well, or more to the point, how poorly you sleep, and all sorts of other things. It's really quite a lot of fun. The folks at Whoop are going to give Behavioral Observations listeners a free month, your first month free. So if you want to learn more, head over to behavioralobservations.com/Whoop and follow the prompts from there, and give it a go if this is something you're interested in. All right, let's get back to the conversation with Kim. It occurs to me as you're giving that explanation there, I've heard these these kind of things thrown around once, and I'm wondering if there's any research basis to it. But as far as like learning the basics of reading and math, I remember hearing someone in the precision teaching community say something to the effect of like 60% of the kids are going to just learn how to read and learn how to do math. In spite of, average or even substandard instruction, and a lot of this business of these kind of more fine-tuned interventions, the things that that you guys do, that Morningside and other places do, is more addressed towards the other members of the remainder, if you will, the other 35-40% or whatever. Again, I'm not aware. Have you heard stats like that before? And if so, are you aware if this is that mythology or folklore, behavioral folklore or educational folklore or whatever?
So I absolutely disagree with a statement of that sort, because it's incorrect.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. That's the first thing I wanted to learn about that. Yeah.
If whoever made that statement suggested that 60% of kids just learn to do math and read on their, naturally, that's actually not correct at all.
Well, I mean, I don't mean naturally. I mean, like this, like in
I know what you mean by just a tradition, by being in the traditional school system.
Yeah.
But my point is that's an incorrect statement.
Okay, all right.
Our educational statistics that are clear, and anyone can access these data. They exist. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And if you just Google NAEP or National Assessment of Educational Progress, it'll take you to the government's website. Anyone can evaluate our educational statistics right now. It's available to the public. So 60% of kids are not learning to do math and read well in the school system. That's actually incorrect. So like I said before, our current statistics are that more than 60% of kids are below proficiency in all academic subjects. And that, like I said before, that increases to more than 80% for children of color and those living in poverty. So that statement alone is incorrect because that's not what's happening. And then I would go a step further and say the mediocritization of our culture is something that everyone should be concerned about. And so just because, a certain percentage of kids are achieving average levels of performance, like they're hitting the proficient level at probably the minimum. I'll tell you, less than 10% of American students score in the advanced levels in any academic subject. That is horrifying. Because if you look at these tests, and again, this is what I do for a living, so I spend a lot of time on what the subdomains of the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, entail.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's mind-numbing. I do a lot of analysis of what their proficiency levels actually mean. And the proficient level on the NAEP is synonymous with about a fourth grade level of functioning. So I can't tell you how horrifying it is to think about the fact that less than 10% of kids score in the advanced levels. And I know for a fact, because I do this myself, that in 40 hours of instruction at Fit Learning, we take kids to the upper quartile. So we move kids from the lower quartile to the upper quartile, meaning they're moving from like the 20th percentile to the 75th percentile in 40 hours of instruction. Imagine that. Imagine a world where the way our educational system is designed is producing kids who come out of school as experts. They come out of school as advanced thinkers, advanced readers, advanced writers, and advanced mathematicians. Imagine the progress our society would make if we weren't just dealing with kids who kind of learned it a little bit and can function somewhat in society. Is that our standard?
Right.
Is that our standard, that we want kids who are just pretty mediocre? I mean, they're not suffering and failing. And look, that's also a white privilege statement. Like, that's also another reason why I don't love that statement, because that statement was really only referring to white kids. Because like white kids, yeah, if you don't look at our NAEP data with respect to all kids combined, if you look at white kids, there's a little bit more than 50% at the proficient level. But white kids aren't a little more, a little more than 50% proficient in academic subjects because of their ability. They're that way because because our culture is racist. Because kids who come from white families have parents who can supplement instruction, who can provide enriched environments because they themselves are most likely educated. They're most likely have a parent who doesn't have to work 3 jobs. Sure. And try to also provide an enriched environment. So statements like that are also blind to the inequity in educational opportunities for children of color and children of poverty. So no kid's doing great. And I actually point this out in my book. And if you go to my website, drkimberlyberens.com, I have put up some figures on my website under the tab, The Crisis. And you'll actually see the breakdown in proficiency levels across race and ethnicity. No one's doing great. I mean, white kids are doing better and Asian kids are doing better, but no, it's not like 80 to 90% of Asian and white kids are like crushing it. They're kind of getting by, and white kids have a safety net more often than not where they can make it anyway. So I absolutely profoundly disagree. I mean, I love my precision teaching community, but I profoundly disagree with statements of that sort, because that's
And again, I can't remember where I heard that, and I might have misheard it. So I don't want to make a false attribution, but I just want to. I honestly just want to know whether that was true or not. And so
just to chime in one more thing. And I have a ton of these kids at Fit, kids who quote unquote sail through school without difficulty. Those kids could be functioning 3 to 4 years ahead. I mean, those kids who sail through school are being tragically mediocritized. Because if you can do pretty well in a really poorly designed, highly ineffective educational system, imagine how those kids could be performing in a intentionally designed, science-based educational system. It's mind-boggling. Like you can't imagine the outcomes those kids make at Fit Learning. Like, it is shocking. I mean, I'm talking 3 years growth in a small amount of hours. I mean, these kids are bored out of their minds in schools. So those kids matter too. We should be shifting the entire bell curve, multiple standard deviations. So average ain't great. Let's just remember that. Average is not proficient. Average is average. And at best, average is kind of not going to contribute to greatness in the world.
Thank you for dispelling that myth. I appreciate that. And so, all right. I want to get back to the kind of dissemination aspect of this really important information. So you've embarked on this kind of popular press medium, if you will. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because I think there's some lessons more broadly for the field, because education is one area, but obviously behavior analysis has contributions to make in a whole host of areas that involve any aspect of what we do as humans for the most part. So I'm hoping that, someone listening to this who has like a sports and health or health and fitness interest could get something out of this, or if they have, if they're interested, if listeners are interested in issues about, behavior change, concerning the environment or climate change or whatever, I think there are a lot of things that can be learned from this. So I want to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive here on the publishing process. I know when I talked with Steve Hayes when he published A Liberated Mind a few years ago, he talked about needing a platform, so we talked a little bit about the kind of publishing world and things like that. Now I know you two went in different directions with it, and he is being published by one of the kind of big five, if you will, publishing houses, and you went shockingly you did something more independent. But anyway, and so that's involved a couple of things. You've been making these media appearances. You've been talking to different stakeholders using different language. You've been writing like blog posts on Medium and elsewhere. And so I would love for you to just share your thoughts a little bit on how you communicate these really complicated matters in such a way that anyone can really understand it. So you can take that pretty much in any direction you want, but I'm just,
right.
It's an area that I'm super curious about, and I think a lot of listeners would be as well.
Well, one thing I will say is, I definitely committed, the first 20 years of my career has been devoted to developing and evolving the model, doing the applied science and evolving a replicable model of instruction that produces profound outcomes. And we've done that. And look, I'm not saying we're finished. We're never finished. I mean, we're constantly evolving and getting better and looking for our errors and figuring out ways we can improve and where are holes in our, that's why we're scientists. We look for our mistakes. We look for our errors. We look for like where we're not doing good enough, well enough. So that was my first 20 years. But now I'm at the point where, it's time to start telling people about this in a big way. It's time to start communicating with the public. And one thing I will say, as I've embarked on this journey, and now I've been doing this for, it's not even 2 years that I've really been trying to have a public presence. I will say the public are up for it, which has been really amazing. Because when I started embarking on this, it remains scary, and it is scary. But what has been unbelievably refreshing and just awesome is how the public wants this. Even though the public may not be able to articulate what's not working, why it isn't working, why some of the explanations that modern psychology, pop culture psychology puts out there are kind of fluffy and they don't really buy into it. The public is actually up for this because it makes sense. I mean, if we have one thing on our side as a science, is that it is common sense. I mean, parents do, even though they may not be good at it, they actually do have firsthand knowledge of the power of consequences. I mean, hello, they get that and they get it. Now, they don't get it at the level of how important it is to be consistent and how precise that selection process actually is, and how it's not some big, more macro level reward type situation. It's actually selection by consequences. They don't understand it at that technical level, but parents get this. I mean, teachers get this. Teachers know that the reason a majority of their kids are failing in their classrooms is because they can't add and they can't subtract, and they are still trying to sound out words in 6th grade. Teachers get it. They can't do anything about it and they can't fix it, but they actually get it. So one thing we actually need to get maybe better about is not being defensive, not being immediately afraid that our listeners are going to attack us, because I do think that's something there for us in our field. Like, we've been so marginalized and ostracized in the history of our field that people are wary, but actually people are up for this. I mean, I have had an unbelievable response, and people want more. And more. Like, I have some publicists that work for me. And initially it was like trying to get people to take my op-eds, right? And my blogs. I'm getting unbelievable. Like I get so many requests for op-eds. I can't meet the timeline. Like I'm having to like say no to some stuff now, which is shocking, right? Like I'm not trying to push my way into the public, and it didn't take that long. Like, so on one hand, it's the public is up for it and wants to hear it. On the other hand, we offer a unique, fresh, different perspective. If you do, and in doing popular press, I spend a lot of time in popular press. So I see what's, what's filling the airwaves. Everyone is saying the same stuff and nothing changes. And the public aren't dumb. Like they're sick of reading the same old stuff. Like, the same gimmicks and the same fads and it's boring. I'll be quite honest, is boring. So one of the, my lead publicist, Robin, one of her statements to me recently was, you're in demand because you have an alternative perspective that is unique and empowering and interesting. And people want to hear it. We all have that perspective in behavior science. So I think it's more empowering behavior analysts to realize that people want to hear what you have to say. Don't immediately think they're going to attack you, because that's going to actually shift how you communicate. Like if you communicate from a space of defensiveness and fear of how your listener is going to respond, that immediately impacts the power of your communications, right? But if you come from a value of, I care about making a difference, and I am passionate about our science, and I'm passionate about human life and the quality of it, and I know our science is an access point there, and you trust the public to want to hear what you have to say, that creates a very different communication. So that has been my experience in this. It has not been punishing. I mean, I've had one really negative interview, only one out of a bunch that I've done. And I haven't gotten hate mail, and I haven't gotten haters. I mean, I'm waiting. I mean, my book's not out yet, so we'll see. I'm sure they're coming, but I do have to say people are up for this and they want to hear it. And this is the time. Like if there's ever been a time for us to be more vocal in our science, it's now. We are in a massive breakdown in every aspect of our society, and our science has a solution for all of those breakdowns. Right. Because it's all about human behavior, period. Everything you hear, every epidemiologist, every scientist, every medical doctor say about COVID, it is changing human behavior. That's it. That's all they're talking about. Social distancing, wear masks. It's about changing human behavior. Everything is about changing human behavior. And all of the breakdowns are police violence against people of color. That is a human behavior problem. Like this is all about problems with human behavior. I mean, and if there's anyone people should pay attention to, it's Tony Biglin. I mean, his book that he just released, Rebooting Capitalism, is mind-boggling. I was privileged to be asked to be an advanced reader on that book, which was one of the highlights of my entire career. And everyone should read that book, because he is addressing issues in our culture that are at every level of our culture. And he is providing solutions, and he has a nonprofit organization that he has started to, that everyone can be involved in. That's impacting human behavior through behavior science in every level of our society. So Tony Biglin is someone everyone should be paying attention to, because he is doing this in a powerful way. So there are those of us, there's people out there doing this, and more people need to be doing this. And it's, yes, talking to ourselves and publishing in behavioral journals and involving our science matters.
So we have to
communicate to the public.
Yeah. And I will put a link to that book in the show notes. And I followed Dr. Biglin on Twitter, and I've seen some of the outreach that he does, certainly from that perspective. So what I want to do is kind of get down to some specifics in terms of, most people who are going to listen to this are people working in schools and clinics and in home programs and things like that. What are some takeaways that you've learned about how to speak more plainly, if you will, as Pat Fryman likes to say, plain English, please, or speak English, please. Sorry, Pat, if I'm misquoting you, but the idea is this, is the same. I mean, I know we say that what are some ways to kind of execute on that, or what are some ways that you've found helpful? Like, perhaps sometimes, we get really caught up in the distinction between a reward and a reinforcer, but in everyday parlance with parents and other stakeholders, I'm more comfortable using those terms interchangeably. So that's kind of like one strategy I use. Like, are there things that you've found that, when I say this instead of that, that really kind of connects with people, or they resonate with X, Y, or Z?
Right. So, and again, just to be clear, I'm coming from a very different field. I talk to people around, academic skill acquisition and improving cognitive skills and sophisticated language skills. So, I talk about processing speed. I'm not going to lie. Do I think that that's what's really occurring? No. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for kids getting, their rates of responding increasing in visual and auditory learning channels, So look, I use some of that lingo. I talk about processing speed. We have data on the impacts of our methodology for improving IQ. Do I think IQ is real? No. IQ is a behavioral repertoire. But people believe in IQ. And so, there are things that I do that I think match the culture. I also am I read more neuroscience than I do behavior analysis journals, because the stuff that's going on in neuroscience and behavior biology, everyone should be paying attention to. Because I don't know if anyone remembers Skinner's comment, and I can't quote it from the direct text, but the physiologist of the future will be able to answer these questions, like some of these unknowns in our field.
I know the passage. I can't quote it chapter and verse either, but I'm familiar with it.
Well, guess what? Skinner was right. And look, I think it's not that neuroscientists are answering questions, but neuroscientists are discovering the neurological processes underlying the behavioral processes that we've understood and known for a long time. So all of the most amazing research, I don't want to say research, science coming out, because there's such a weird gray area there with research and science. That's another kind of thing I'm into right now. The amazing science coming out of that field is actually demonstrating what's occurring at a neurological level when people are behaving in their environments and that behavior is being reinforced.
Do you have a particular lab or a particular journal that you follow that you find good stuff in, or a particular?
Oh God, it's kind of all over the place. But I might have a book that's really fantastic, and let's see if it's here or if it's at my house. So there's a book called Neuroplasticity by Moheb Kastandi, and he's out of MIT. MIT has got some amazing stuff coming out of there, to be honest with you. And this book is so easy to read because this is a dissemination book. He wrote this. Oh no.
What?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I lost you. My screen went weird. I apologize.
No. I think it's when you got excited about MIT, and I think that's probably what.
So he's written a book on neuroplasticity that is literally for the lay public. So he's done what I did with blind spots, like he's done for the lay public about neuroscience, and it is phenomenal. And so what he's really summarizing is what's been discovered in the area of neuroplasticity around how instruction, how what occurs in a human's environment is actually what produces neurological change, which is what neuroplasticity is. And we're like, duh, like a behavioral process is a neurological process, and a neurological process is a behavioral process. Just because you certain fields want to ideologically separate those things doesn't mean it's true. But they're actually real. What I love in behavioral biology is doing this as well, where they're actually realizing reductionism doesn't work when you're talking about learning. When you're looking at learning processes, you can't reduce it. And that is like one of the take home points. Like, you can't reduce it to genes. You can't reduce it to neurology. They're actually discovering that reductionism is an inappropriate model for learning, because learning is a behavioral process and requires a behaving organism in an environment. And so what's amazing is that they're finally getting it, that you can't reduce learning to genes. You can't reduce behavior to neurology, because it's all the same system. And it doesn't work, and one part doesn't work without the other part. So behavior analysts should be really paying attention to that research, because it's extremely, it's verifying what we've known all along. So that's one thing I will say. The other thing I really want to say, and I know I say this a lot, and I'm not, I know it sometimes comes off as a criticism, but if we don't get it on board with what our science actually is, if we're engaging in contradictions of ourselves, the public isn't going to believe us. And that's one thing I have going for me, is that I'm not talking about how much better my practices are and then using the same measures they use in education that are failing kids. Like, I'm not sitting here trying to talk about reinforcement and then trying to demonstrate its effectiveness with percent correct. Mm-hmm. Which you can't. You can't measure behavior and learning without looking at rate. You can't measure behavior and learning without looking at dimensional units of behavior. So one thing I do think that people who do the work I do, who use standard acceleration and dimensional units of behavior in their practice at all times, and because of that, we are actually doing applied science at all times. Because I do that, I can absolutely separate myself from what traditional education actually is. But if I wrote my book, and I'm talking, I wouldn't be, actually, to be honest with you, my book wouldn't exist if I didn't do what I do, because I wouldn't have evolved a method and I wouldn't be effective like I am. So, but behavior analysis, there's a lot of contradictions going on in our applied branch that are really problematic for the effective dissemination of our work, because you can't be in an IEP meeting criticizing IEP goals and trying to give advice about why kids are failing when you aren't using when your measurement systems aren't any better, and when you're actually not doing applied science yourself. You may be putting percent correct on a sessions chart, but that's no better than writing some arbitrary IEP goal on a piece of paper in an IEP meeting and wondering why behavior doesn't change. So I think our field's in trouble if we don't get unified around what our subject matter is, what our measurement system is, and what our science really is. So I think that's another reason behavior analysts have trouble talking to the public, because they contradict themselves a lot. You can't be critical of an establishment that you are using, practices that come from that establishment in your own practices. Percent correct and accuracy measures and arbitrary mastery criterion and session charts, that comes from education. That doesn't come from behavioral science. So you can't kind of be a behavioral scientist. You either are or you aren't. And if you're not, then you're basically lecturing a community of people, but you're doing similar stuff. You may understand reinforcement, you may understand the principles, but your methodology is not that different than what teachers are doing already. So, if we can't demonstrate the power of our science by, number one, producing mind-blowing outcomes that no one thinks are possible, and that's only achievable when you're using methods that allow you to be effective, which means standardized measurement systems, dimensional units of behavior, real time. If you're not using those things, then you're not doing our science. And so then what are you selling? Are you selling a cookbook approach that, you got to use reinforcement? Well, how do you know reinforcement works if you're not measuring it effectively? Mm-hmm. You talk about stimulus control. Well, you can't measure the establishment of stimulus function and the emergence of operant behavior if you're using percent correct and stretch to fill graphs. So there's a big disconnect between the principles and the analysis of behavior that's occurring in our applied branch. And that is going to deeply impact how powerful people can be in their communications about our science.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. Got it. That's I appreciate that point. That's certainly we've talked about that in our previous chats and things like that. And as tempted as I am to kind of continue down that, I think
I know we've done this enough.
I want to get back to something else though that you mentioned earlier, and circle back to that, and that's this idea of you said processing speed as a metaphor, and one of the things
Right.
you got into with the controversial exchange folks a little bit too is things like dyslexia and other types
Right.
of learning disabilities and whatnot. And I know this is going to be something that's probably hotly contested or what have you, and I want to bring it up nonetheless. And so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you guys were talking about the reification of some of these concepts or constructs rather. So I want to just kind of give you free reign to talk about learning disabilities in general. And I think you said something like some of them are real, some of them aren't, or something like that. So I'd like you to just kind of elucidate the audience and give us your take on these things. So
Great. I'm happy to do that. So I will tell you, just a little plug, that's my next book. I've kind of started working on the research for it. I don't know. It'll probably be a couple years before I can get that accomplished. But, my next book is exclusively about this.
Okay.
So, learning disabilities is one of the most tragic, misapplications of science that has occurred, I believe, in the last century. And it is shocking when you actually go underneath where that comes from and you really do a historical analysis of when learning disabilities began to emerge, how much this has been made up and how bad the research that's been done is presented as proving, and I'm using air quotes, proving that learning disabilities exist, how actually pseudoscientific most of that research is, and how it's presented as causational, but it's actually all correlational. So it's a tragedy. So like in the 1950s is when ADHD, one of the first learning disability diagnoses, kind of emerged. Now, someone started working at, it was called word blindness, and that was back in the Orton, who's now the Orton-Gillingham approach. He was a I don't know if he was a neuroscientist or a neurosurgeon, or anyway, he started doing work in the 1920s and 1930s with individuals who had what he called word blindness. And so all of that, evolved into dyslexia. But what I will say about learning disabilities is there is zero, and I am not kidding, there is zero evidence that learning disabilities are real, that learning disabilities are causal, and that then learning disabilities are indicative of a specific brain impairment that is the reason kids don't learn specific skills. There is no causational research. The only causational research that exists is that effective instruction alters neurological profiles of children who have been diagnosed with specific learning disabilities. That is the only that's the only causational research that actually used the scientific method appropriately and manipulated variables. And so the only research that actually exists that's real science contradicts all of the learning disability stuff that's out there. So most learning disability, and I'm not going to use studies, correlational research that's been done involves like brain scans of kids who've been diagnosed with specific things and those who haven't, and just indicating that certain parts of the brain are more, have more white matter or are more stimulated in kids without that disability in certain areas of the brain than they have. And then they present that as a cause. So they say, see, we found it. We found these areas of the kids' brains that aren't as activated as these other kids who aren't diagnosed this way. So it's, that's the cause. So since their brains are dysfunctional in that way. And then they present that as, we found it. See, dyslexia is real. Central auditory processing disorder is real. All of these made up nonverbal learning disorder is real. So they use these correlational brain scan studies as evidence of a causal relation when none has been demonstrated. So all they have found is that poor readers have a different neurological profile than readers who have learned to read well. And as behavioral scientists, I would suggest that, is anyone surprised by that? Are we surprised to know that kids who have a very weak or poorly established behavioral repertoire also don't have the neurological profile that would match a child who has a well-established behavioral repertoire. Of course we don't, because we know, and we always have known, and now neuroscience is validating our knowledge that neurological profiles are produced by learning. It's not the other way around. So it's not that our brains exist in a certain form and drive and push us to learn stuff. It's that we are given opportunities to learn stuff in our environment, and we behave with respect to a subject matter in a particular way, and then that behavior is reinforced, and that's what produces neurological changes. So kids who have been in poor reading instruction and have weak and poorly established reading repertoires, well, of course, they have different neurological profiles than readers who have had a different history. And it's changing that history and strengthening and improving that behavioral repertoire, which is actually going to produce a change in their neurology. But this is what is a complete misunderstanding in neuropsychology. And it's presented, and it's dangerously masked as science. So the public believes that dyslexia is real, that all of these things are real, and that the reason their kids can't read well is because they have something wrong with their brains, which has now institutionalized the practice of writing off failure, academic failure, as a result of a problem inherent with the learner, rather than as a problem with their learning history. So
can I ask a question here? So would someone be flagged as dyslexic who just might, or for kids who have diagnoses or of dyslexia, do they represent just the individual differences? Like, in other words, kind of getting back to the kind of myth that you busted earlier, but perhaps to the tiny extent which some, I guess where I'm going at is that is this just a representation of individual differences of how kids respond to quote unquote traditional education, and some kids might need more specialized instruction or different types of instruction, more precise instruction? In other words, I'm just trying to get a sense as, okay, well, there is a cluster of individuals who perhaps take longer to learn how to read or have more difficulty learning how to read, and I understand your point about perhaps not calling them dyslexic, but how do we talk about this, I guess, in a way that makes sense, that acknowledges that I mean, assuming all kids in a third grade classroom get exposed to the same curriculum, right?
And what you just said is the key take home point. They get exposed, which does not equal learning, as I hope we all know.
Mm-hmm.
So my answer to your question is, although the learning process is the same, no child has the same learning history. And if we think they do, that's insane. The minute kids come out, even in the womb, children have different environments. The minute kids are born into the world, they are in an unbelievably unique learning environment where, for whatever reason, and certain responses are reinforced over others. Certain behaviors are strengthened and selected and others aren't. So every child on the planet has a different learning history, vastly different. So I really cannot, what I cannot stand in a culture is when because we have such a desire to classify and cluster and group. And like, we're really obsessed with coordination, right? We're obsessed with the frames of coordination. We really want to put people in categories. So we look for similarities, right? But I promise you that every child in a first grade class has an unbelievably different learning history, and they've had different types of component skills selected and strengthened, and others haven't been. Now, there does come a point where kids who have had such an ineffective learning history, it becomes dysfunctional, and they cannot, participate. But the problem is our educational system doesn't catch that. And so these kids get pushed on to first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, and those skills are never remedied. So I will tell you, in my over 20-year career working with children and doing a lot of work in literacy, which is one of my, primary areas, the number one commonality between kids who I work with who come in with dyslexia diagnoses and those who don't is, number one, children with dyslexia always have extreme deficits in phonics and phonemic awareness, meaning they came from schools that emphasized whole word reading and sight reading rather than phonics and decoding. That is a classic. Kids who have dyslexia diagnoses always have unbelievably low rates of responding and high rates of incorrect responding on phonics and decoding skills. So those kids have failed to acquire phonics and decoding as a reading strategy. The kids who I assess who don't have dyslexia diagnoses but have some reading fluency problems, they have some phonics established in their repertoire always. They have some ability to decode in their repertoire always. It may not be masterful and it needs to be improved, but the difference is the glaring deficiency in phonics and phonemic awareness for kids who come in with dyslexia diagnoses. Another very common characteristic for kids who have dyslexia diagnoses is visual attending deficits, meaning they are sloppy lookers. They tend to make stem letter errors. They tend to see B's and D's and P's and Q's the same. They tend to see I's and lowercase I's and L's the same. They have a deficient visual discrimination repertoire. That if you even go underneath phonics, it's like in popular, in speech pathology, they call it rapid automatic naming. So they tend to have they have deficits in rapid automatic naming speeds, meaning they have a really hard time seeing and rapidly identifying visual stimuli. So that's another really common characteristic. And oftentimes they have deficits in attending across the board. So, and look, might that be somewhat neurological? Sure. They may have neurological profiles or some kind of genetic. I have no access to that and I have no idea. And I would never use that as an explanation if I can't measure it and see it. So sure, they may have been born with some neurological difference that made it more difficult for them to acquire visual discrimination skills. So I'm not saying that there might not be some inherent neurological thing that makes it more difficult for them to acquire a specific skill. But the name dyslexia doesn't explain that. It doesn't explain that at all. And it also completely removes any source of effective action, because then you can just explain away the problem and say, oh, it's their disability, it's their disability, it's their disability, rather than doing an analysis of what skills deficits do they have in their repertoire that we need to move, that we need to strengthen and shape and make fluent. I have plenty of kids who not a single learner in FIT has ever followed the same path to mastery. No one does. All kids show up with different barriers, different component skill deficits, different component skill strengths, because their learning histories are unique. But classifying them and naming them as something doesn't solve anything. All it does is ensure that the problem never gets solved, because now we can excuse away failure by a name, a syndrome.
Right. I'm glad we avoided controversial topics in this episode.
Always, right?
Yes, it's Dr. Kim Berens is the website where you can direct. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. Yes, exactly. That's where all the complaints can go.
I'm kidding. No,
just remember, look, when I say these things,
I'm just teasing.
I don't say these things to be mean. I say these things because I care about the success of children. I care about the success of our educational system, and I care about the success of teachers. That's where this comes from. It doesn't come from me being right. It doesn't come from me it comes from that place.
Yeah, I totally get it. I'm just teasing. So let's, so the general idea is that these things are amenable change. They're not these kind of static profiles that you just have to kind of accommodate moving forward. And it's one of the things I see a lot. And, as a guy who's running around schools trying to help kids, improve their behavior and, learn to manage and navigate life a little bit more effectively and with fewer problems, oftentimes that bumps into, there's a lot of comorbid educational deficits.
Yep.
And I talk to a lot of teachers about those issues and things like that. And a lot of these teachers, will have kids who are in, upper elementary, even in middle and high school, who are still counting on their fingers, or they're given, a multiplication chart, or they're given, calculators to use and stuff like that. And, maybe those are appropriate supports at some point or another. I don't know. But, I always make the point, I'm not a precision teacher. I'm not, I don't have training in these sorts of things, but I can use common sense and say, look, when this kid's trying to do long division, if he's going to reference this other thing here and count on his fingers and do it's just going to make it, it's just going to suck. It's going to be
oh God, I
aversive,
can't stand it. I can't stand it.
it's painful enough to watch it, but but to experience it must be terrible. And if he just and I think also give another example. I think I was talking to the other Dr. Berens, your husband Nick, a while ago, and he was saying that there was this kid in like 6th or 7th grade he was working with once, and was having trouble reading, and it just turned out that just kind of hammering the basic letter sounds, going way back, was this kind of key that unlocked his ability to read more fluently writ large. And so I'm wondering if you have some advice for if there's a teacher listening to this right now who's hopefully still with us, and and she's he or she has a kid, and let's say they're an 8th grade teacher, and there's a kid counting on his fingers. So there's a kid who might not know the letter sounds and things like that. And let's also, just for the sake of example, stipulate they're in kind of quote unquote kind of normal public school where they're following kind of a manualized curriculum with perhaps not a ton of flexibility. What advice would you have for this teacher in terms of what are some ways to think about maybe helping this kid remedy some of these deficits, imagining that they don't have the resources that say like a Fit Learning Lab would, and things like that?
Well, and that's the problem. Because to be quite frank, there's not much a teacher can do. I mean, when you are, let's say you're a 4th grade math teacher and you are expected to follow state standards, you are expected to follow that timeline, to expose kids to those lessons, test them, and move on according to a timeline. And I promise you, a majority of kids in her classroom are still counting on their fingers because schools do not provide the time required for kids to master their math facts to fluency. They don't build it into the school day. It's an afterthought, and kids are expected to practice that at home. So a majority of 4th grade math teachers have kids in their classroom who have no business doing long division, decimals, fractions, percents, and the relationship between those things, geometry. They can't. But teachers have to follow what the district tells them. So, I mean, if I'm speaking as an instructional designer and as a precision teacher and as a behavioral scientist, I'd say stop everything and spend the entire class period on fluencies in core mathematics. It's all pointless. To be quite honest, it's absolutely pointless if you have a child who doesn't understand place value and isn't fluent at identifying the place value of numbers, trying to learn the new math about how to do multi-digit addition and subtraction, because the new math requires, rather than just carrying and borrowing, it actually requires kids to understand how many thousands, how many hundreds, how many tens, pulling those apart, rounding up. Like, to be quite honest, the new math is even worse because kids are having to do all these, new number breakdown strategies, but you can't break down a number if you actually don't even have fluency in place value.
Is that the thing where you draw it looks like a big tic-tac-toe thing? Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah.
There's so much new math. And look, I'm not saying that as a conceptual understanding isn't awesome. That is awesome as a conceptual understanding. Like, understanding what 4,879 really is fabulous. But then there comes a point where a kid just has to execute a multi-digit math problem and they don't have time to make a grid and a standardized test. They just need to solve the dang problem. So teachers are handcuffed. Mm-hmm. It breaks my heart. Because even teachers who understand instructional design and component skills, they understand that long division is comprised of like 100 basic math skills. And if those 100 basic math skills aren't proficient, you can forget it. You can just give a kid a calculator because that's all you're going to get. You can give a kid a calculator because otherwise they're never going to be able to solve that because they can't execute it without all of their basic math skills in place. So what I would say to teachers is get angry, get with your union, demand effective instruction, effective training in instructional design and precision teaching and direct instruction and curriculum-based measurement. and protest the way schools are designed, which is that you have to expose kids to a bunch of stuff according to some arbitrary timeline and move on regardless of student performance. That is why we're in a mess. Kids don't get better at skills because they turn a year older. That is a myth. Development has nothing to do with skills. Now, development has everything to do with your physiology, but just because you turn 7 doesn't mean you're magically going to be able to engage in second grade math or reading skills. That is absolutely false. You cannot advance up a curriculum ladder until you've mastered the skills below the higher level skills. And that is not only common sense, it is scientifically proven. So the only thing teachers can do is get super angry and protest and band together and say, they actually are the source of some serious change. Citizens should vote and demand their legislators change stuff, and teachers should demand change. It has to happen that way or nothing is going to change. All teachers can do is say, go home and do Excel. I'm not giving any homework. Like, that's something they could do. They could say, I'm not giving any homework. Every night you have to go home and do IXL math and improve your fluency in core math. Because IXL math's a really great math app, and it's timed and it counts rate of response. And it has scope and sequences for all mathematics, basic numeracy, computation, fractions, and it's timed fluency drills. So like if I was a 4th grade math teacher and noticed that a majority of my class was counting on their fingers, I would stop giving homework and the homework would be go home and do math drills in core mathematics. Like, that's all they can do is just say, okay, well, follow the state standards and check the boxes, but I'm not making these kids go home and try to do this stuff that they can't do in the classroom. I'm going to make them go home and practice their math facts.
Yeah. And so probably the more time on that would allow them to catch up with the curriculum later on. All right. Very cool. All right. I know we don't have a ton of time left. I want to get to some questions from the Behavioral Observations membership group, though. Okay. And so the first one comes from Kay, and she said, my question as a school-based person would be, are the fit learning people working in public schools to integrate their practices into RTI academic models? And if not, how could school-based people such as myself collaborate with them on doing this?
Right. So, I will say I tried to go in the front door of schools many, many years ago. That was my dissertation, was actually a very large teacher training study in Washoe County School District in Nevada. So I tried to go in the front door of schools for a long time. And that has never been that wasn't very effective. We also were committed to being free to design and evolve our model and do the science on that model without district constraints, without these arbitrary constraints that I've been talking about all day today. So we're operating in a vacuum, meaning we are in absolute control of our method. We're absolutely in control of our science. We do not have to follow any district guidelines. Now, that being said, we have over 20 years of data now, evidencing the effectiveness of our methodology, and it is now replicable, and we've replicated it over 40 locations. So now is the time to start replicating our model inside of schools. And, that is, absolutely one of our missions. So there's a pilot project happening in Florida that is under a grant where, there's some people being trained to provide this method of instruction to kids in low-income schools. And then Mary Sawyer in Atlanta, who runs our Atlanta location, she's also done a pilot study in some schools in South Carolina. So we've done this, and usually we do it under grants. But we absolutely are committed to training school personnel to apply our model of instruction. I mean, that's really the point. Like, we had the luxury of evolving the model without those kinds of constraints, and now we have a model. So, districts that are willing to do the work, I mean, this isn't a curriculum, and that's what districts don't quite understand, is like they just want to buy the curriculum and have like a 2-hour teacher workshop. No.
I know.
Like, it doesn't work that way. So teachers have to be fully committed, which means they are getting to a long-term relationship with us. They are, not only are they licensing our materials, but they are licensing training and supervision of implementation in their districts. because they're committed to producing measurable outcomes with learners and acting like scientists in our implementation of this. So we are absolutely committed to doing this in schools, and it's just finding the right schools to partner with who are on board with doing this the right way. Because there's no cutting corners. This isn't about a curriculum. Now, the curriculum matters, instructional design matters, but in a vacuum and isolation, it's completely ineffective. So it's learning how to act like a behavior scientist in your classroom, and having schools committed to giving teachers the training to do that, and giving them the freedom and leeway to do that when they're trained.
Got it.
So that takes a unique kind of partnership.
All right. The second question comes from Ashley. Ashley's completing her PhD in special ed, and she feels passionately about disseminating natural science into the field of education. She said, I'm wondering if Dr. Berens is familiar with Project Follow Through. I think I know the answer to this.
Yeah, I would say yes.
And if she is aware of anyone trying to disseminate research or expand the use of scientifically based curricula in schools with at-risk children. And I would say, just as an aside, Ashley, check out the interview I did with Michael Maloney, where he talks extensively about Project Follow Through. But let's see. I'm also curious if she's heard of Theory of Instruction by Engelman and Carnine, and if yes, what are her thoughts on its viability and credibility for organizing knowledge systems and stimulus control?
Okay, so I'm absolutely very familiar with Project Follow Through. I actually do talk about Project Follow Through in my book. So that would be a great resource for you to check out my book. There's a lot of Project Follow Through in that book. So I'm absolutely familiar with Project Follow Through. I will say that inside of, science, evidence-based approaches, and this gets back to my comment a little while ago about science versus research. One of the problems with educational research nowadays is that it is all large in, if it's done at all, it's very large in, and it's all statistical analyses, similar to like clinical trials, right? Mm-hmm. And look, I'm not trying to say that large in research doesn't have a purpose, and that clinical trials doesn't obviously serve a very important purpose in our culture, in our civilization. But what's the difference is, applying a technique. This is what's wrong with Orton Gillingham and Wilson and some of these cookbook methods, is that like everyday mathematics. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but this is a massive fallout because there was some research, and I'm using air quotes again, done on everyday mathematics. And then all of a sudden it became implemented in every single school across the country, and it was correlated with a massive decline in math proficiency in the United States, to the point that it's now outlawed in several states, just like whole word instruction is. So the problem with educational research is, number one, you have to check the demographic in which it's being used, because everyday mathematics the demographic was rich white kids in Chicago who all came in with pretty well-established component skill repertoires in math. So, of course, it worked pretty well with them because they had proficiencies in math and core math skills. But when you're talking about kids who can't count or add, giving them the opportunity to apply math in weird ways is going to be completely ineffective. And it was. The jury is out on that. Like it didn't work. So what I am pushing in my book and what I do at FIT, it's not about when we train people to do the FIT learning method of instruction, we're not just giving them a pamphlet. Like, we're actually we are doing natural applied science in our work with kids. And this is something else I articulate in my book. We are training people who are trained to do this work are trained to do natural applied science with their kids. Because when you're talking about human learners, when you're talking about human performers, no cookbook approach is ever going to be effective with every human performer. Why? Because human learners come with a different history. Just like I said before, no one has the same history. No one has the same component skill proficiencies or deficits. No one has the same barriers. No. So one cookbook approach is never going to be effective for a majority of kids. So we would never disseminate the FIT learning model without also disseminating the science that you use with every single learner using the model. So it's not just about, here, do this, use this curriculum and teach phonics this way. It's measure learning this way, evaluate mastery this way. And if their accelerations aren't moving the way they need to, here are all the things that you can modify and test and see if it made a difference. It's teaching people to be scientists. So applying techniques that come from evidence-based research is not the same as being trained to do behavioral science with every single child. And that's what is massively misunderstood. So that's why Orton Gillingham doesn't work for a lot of kids. Now, Orton Gillingham is phonics-based reading instruction. It's like a duh. We know that phonics instruction is the most effective way to train proficiency in reading. It's, again, the research is clear on that. But Orton Gillingham is not going to work for every kid, because guess why? There's a lot of kids where they need those modules to be modified in a lot of different ways because it's too much at once, or they're making specific kinds of errors that need to be addressed. So and education should be about behavioral science. Teachers need to be trained to be behavioral scientists, not to apply one specific technique that came out of some big research study. Does that make sense, like that difference?
Yes. And pardon the interruption there, but the official mascot of the Behavioral Observations podcast out. And yes. I must be getting that UPS delivery I was expecting. So he's there probably greeting the gentleman at the door. So, I think I didn't answer the theory of instruction question. So here's that. So theory of instruction is the framework behind direct instruction. So I'm not sure if she's aware of that. So Engelman and Carnine are the founders of direct instruction, which is the most evidence-based method of instruction that exists in the educational establishment. Now, I will say that direct instruction devoid of behavioral science is problematic. Which is why direct instruction evolved over time to almost become, integrated with behavioral science, because the understanding of reinforcement, immediate feedback, rate, all of that became apparent. So direct instruction and theory of instruction is unbelievably valuable inside of instructional design, breaking complex repertoires down into learnable units, how to properly instruct those units, how concept instruction should go. So again, all of her questions I really do answer in my book. I spend a lot of time on direct instruction in my book and on theory of instruction in my book. So those are all really important things to be aware of, but also to understand that, what I talk about is the technology of teaching, which is really what we do at Fit Learning. The technology of teaching is the combination of behavioral science, precision teaching, which is the measurement of behavior, and direct instruction, which is instructional design and how concept instruction should be presented. And then it's also married with curriculum-based measurement, which is global progress monitoring. So none of these are that's why I don't use one or the other. I use a combination of approaches, which is what I am calling the new technology of teaching. It needs to have all those factors or something's missing. Yeah. How I want to get to the next question from the member, but I can't help asking a follow up to that. Is that given what you just said, how transferable is this repertoire that you have spent 20 years developing?
Right.
Are we in the process of looking for unicorns here, or as you're explaining that, I'm like, well, how on God's green earth are we going to get hundreds of thousands of teachers to come around to this way of looking at the world and things like that?
Well, one answer to that question is yes, it is replicable because we've done this. So, starting in a broom closet, and now we have close to 40 locations, and we've replicated our methodology through our training program, which is a certification program based on competency and producing effective outcomes with kids. So we have, gone from having, me to having, a lot of people doing this effectively across the globe. That being said, that is very different than training a bunch of teachers who are working with kids in classrooms. So it is going to be massively challenging. And, one thing I don't get in my book, and I chose not to go there because it's actually a whole nother book, is that, I really believe that the only way this is possible is with tech. And we actually have a tech, company associated with that. We started, the partners, me, Kendra, Donnie, and Nick, we started a technology company where we're developing apps and platforms for providing really fluency-based, mastery-based learning on an app using artificial intelligence. So when I think about the classroom of the future and how this has to be solved, because there is no way that teachers can do the kind of measurement and analysis of learning charts and individualization of instruction at the scale that really needs to happen for no kid to fall through the cracks. I think that a software, a technology needs to provide that. I see teachers as being trained in instructional design and direct instruction of concepts and trained to cluster and group kids according to component skill levels and levels of mastery, and knowing when to move kids from one cluster to the next based on their mastery of a certain level of skills. So I can't see teachers functioning as that in that way, as like intentional designers of their classroom, designers of the scope and sequence of skills, and then designers of individualized instruction pods. So I really see a portion of the day being teachers using direct instruction to effectively teach concepts to clusters of kids who have been grouped together according to learning to skill level. And then after that brief, and again, when you're being effective, it doesn't have to be a 50-minute class period. I'm talking a 5-minute direct instruction interaction. They're doing a quick 5-minute concept lesson. Then those kids go back to their desks, log into their platform, and do their fluency-based practices on a computer platform, while another 5 kids go up to the front of the room and get effective concept instruction from the teacher for 5 minutes. And it's a rotating schedule with a software program supporting and facilitating mastery-based instruction where kids are practicing in the classroom. And so we're working on that at FIT. Again, that's a huge project. It's not a small undertaking, and it takes a lot of money. Nick's had to step away from this, but he's like going to be approaching venture capital again. If anyone's out there who wants to do venture capital investment in a tech company based in behavioral science to transform the educational system, let me know. So I do think realistically there has to be a tech solution, and there absolutely can be and should be.
All right.
And so I think that's the solution, is that teachers need to have a tech support in their classroom, providing that where it's automatically measuring their behavior, automatically adjusting their lessons or their what they're practicing based on errors or corrects, moving them ahead in a scope and sequence based on mastery, and the computer's doing that automatically. And teachers are really there to facilitate concept instruction and movement of kids through to different learning groups, and then testing global skills, doing ongoing assessments, those kinds of things. Got it.
All right, last listener question here. It's from Celia, and I think you might have gotten to this in some of our earlier conversation here, but feel free to fill in whatever blanks. So she asks, currently kids need standardized testing and perhaps by extension to do poorly on standardized tests in order to qualify for more specialized services like special ed, Title I, et cetera. What would be an alternative method for assigning support needs to students based on your work in applied behavioral science?
Yep. So, first I will say, standardized tests serve a very specific purpose. I'm definitely not on board with throwing out standardized tests. There's a whole, there's two camps, not just two camps, but there's camps in the United States, get rid of testing altogether. It should all be about testing. So, the idea of throwing away standardized tests is horrifying to me, because we have to have a way to objectively evaluate the effectiveness of our educational system. So that being said, and we also have to all agree that standardized tests measure skills and behavioral repertoires. They don't measure anything inherent to the child. It's not about ability. It's about, they are the most objective measure they are the only objective method for us to evaluate the effectiveness of our educational practices. So they are required and necessary. That's that. Now, standardized tests are absolutely insensitive and useless for designing they're not prescriptive. So they really provide you a global understanding of how a child's doing with a specific, in a specific academic area, and how they compare with their peers or how they compare with proficiency levels. Great. They're not going to tell you what's missing in a child's repertoire, why they're performing that way, how to fix it. That information is not going to come from a standardized test and never will. And so standardized tests are useless for a majority of kids. Like a majority of kids need other types of progress monitoring tools used that are more sensitive to what's occurring in the classroom. And also standardized tests can't be administered very often. So you're only getting to look at them once a year rather than an ongoing progress monitoring method to have an intimate contact with, like, is what I'm doing in the classroom making a difference in terms of some broad long-term goal? You don't want to just look at that once a year. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of curriculum-based measurement. When anyone who's familiar with RTI, curriculum-based measurement is the reason RTI exists. So the curriculum-based measurement people are the contributions they have made to education and for the ability for us to bridge what's going on in the classroom and instructional design with standardized tests is invaluable. I can't overemphasize it enough. So in my book, I talk about curriculum-based measurement. It is an aspect of what I call the technology of teaching. So CBM, or curriculum-based measurement, is a way to do ongoing progress monitoring as well as quarterly benchmarking of skills of kids you are working with to have you be in more precise and intimate contact with like broad scale growth on a skill. So CBM is really, really important. But you also need to be able to really look at component skills. Like that's something CBM is not going to give you. Like, so that's why I had to develop my own assessment for the last 20 years, where I'm looking at reading and every single component skill involved in reading and evaluating that according to rate of response. CBM is not going to give that to you either. So CBM is still not precise and prescriptive enough. I had to invent my own thing to make that happen. And, eventually, potentially maybe we will sell that or offer that. I mean, people get our assessment when they get trained in our methodology. That's part of what they get. I had to invent an assessment that was prescriptive enough to identify precise finite skill deficits. But marrying that with CBM and standardized tests is what the technology of teaching is really all about.
All right, very cool. All right, last couple questions here. What's next for you? I know you mentioned a couple of books that are perhaps in development, or at least have been are in concept status, if you will. Certainly. What's next for Fit Learning? Whether, and I know the last time we talked about some of the nonprofit work that you've been doing, the scientist practitioner workshop that I think
yes,
things like that. And I also want to ask you too, and you can kind of wrap this up into your answer also, is that perhaps the last thing I want to leave the listeners with, if you could ask something for the listeners to do or think about or whatever, what would that be?
I love it. Okay, great.
You can answer the first question while you're thinking about the answer to the second one.
A multi-pronged question.
Yes.
So what's next?
Yeah, all of my questions have like eight points to them, I think.
So, Fit Learning, we have so many different, we are always involved in so many different things. So, in terms of the parent company Fit Learning, we are continuing to open more and more locations. We're continuing. I mean, luckily, we've been on virtual. Some of our locations are reopened, but in Tri-State, I'm completely closed. I'm only doing virtual instruction right now. And what's cool is we've been doing virtual instruction at Fit Learning for a long time. Because we had lots of kids who couldn't access a location. So we're really good at virtual instruction. It's where our outcomes are the same as when kids are physically present, unless you have kids with serious behavior problems and who are non-compliant, then that's a problem. But kids who don't have those behavioral barriers, virtual instruction works really well. So luckily, we've continued to thrive under COVID. And we're continuing to certify people and push forward with new locations all over the world. So that's happening on that strand. I will say we do have some, Donnie Newsom is heading up some really cool grant-based projects of doing this inside of schools. I think we're all committed, that's something we want to have happening more in the next decade, is that we're doing more school-wide work, school-wide trainings. Now that we've gotten to this point with the model, like we're all committed to dissemination at that level. We are, moving forward with a national nonprofit with local chapters. Again, I love the nonprofit model because it's still a laboratory model where we can do that precise one-on-one, highly effective, highly scientific work with impoverished children. But even with that, it's still overwhelming about the small number of kids who get to benefit from that. So again, Empower Youth, which is our nonprofit, is important, but doing this inside low-income schools is really more important, because that is, we need to be accessing more and more and more kids and making an impact with more kids. So, but then Empower Youth still going. And then, like I said before, tech, Nick Berens, that's really his passion, is really moving forward with a technological solution for schools. that can support teachers doing this in classrooms. So I really think we'll be revisiting and Nick will be, heavily pushing forward on that tech solution side of things and getting that developed and then piloted and tested. We got through phase 2 of a National Science Foundation grant with our initial platform, which is great. So it's developed. I mean, God, we have so much more we need to do to it, but we've accessed some National Science Foundation funding for that, and that was great. So now, it's time for us to kind of re-energize that with a lot more capital, because we're past that phase. Like, we need a lot more revenue, and it's probably time to bring on investors for that activity. So Nick will be pursuing that kind of line. I have lots more books I want to write, but I definitely have the one that I'm currently in development on as a book around learning disabilities and the myth of learning disabilities. And so I'm hoping to have that out by 2022. We will see, because there's a lot going on. So all those various things, are happening. And then what was your last question? I've lost it now.
If you could ask the audience members,
yes.
What would you ask of them to either consider or do, or what ask would you have for them?
Well, first I'd say read my book. Shameless plug. Order the book.
Right.
No, and look, yeah, I do say that selfishly because I do want people to order the book and buy the book, but I really also say it because I do think that's that's a space to start a conversation. I think it's a space to create a shift in perspective and change the dialogue going on in the educational establishment and the psychological establishment, and create a line of communication between people in our science and people in the public. And I say that because I think that if now more than ever, our connectedness as our humanity, our connectedness, our shared suffering, and our shared values are so important. And are acknowledging that. I mean, it's very divisive. There's a lot of hate. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of wrong making and resentment. And, and that's why also Tony Bigland's book is a must read for everyone, because he really talks about compassion and empathy as the answer to everything. That if we can all unite inside of compassion and empathy for one another, that those values then set the stage for very specific types of actions. And know that, if we all agree on our shared humanity and what we all care about, I think that's a space to then move into discovering pragmatism as the solution for a lot of the things that are wrong in our culture right now, and education being one of them. So I do think, my book is an entryway into that. I would also say, demand better. And it doesn't mean demand better by being an asshole. Sorry, I just swore on your show, by being mean.
That's all right.
But demand better by acknowledging that it can be better and it should be better. And anything that's ever gotten better has gotten better through science. And so expecting more from your virtual instruction that your kids are getting at home. Expecting more from the classroom instruction your children are getting in school. Teachers expecting more from their teacher training, expecting more from their schools, that there's more support. Expecting more from our policymakers, expecting more from our government. I think that we should all expect more and demand more. And the only way to get more is by being more effective. And the only way to be more effective is to use scientific practices. So I think that's a platform from which we can all come from and get some unity around. So that would be my request.
All right. Well, I can't imagine a better note to end on. So drkimberlyberens.com, that's the website where people can learn more about you and kind of the central clearinghouse. And I'll have links to you. I know I follow you on Twitter and things like that. So I'll have links to your social media accounts so people can follow you and keep up to speed with what you're doing and the great message that you have. I'll have all those in the show notes over at behavioralobservations.com. So again, Kim, thanks for joining me for round number 3. Congratulations on the book. It's just a fantastic accomplishment. I'm so happy for you. So thanks so much for being such a great contributor to the field.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And also thank you for being one of my early reviewers.
The pleasure was mine for sure.
That was very nice. So thank you for being willing to read it and giving me such lovely feedback and a really, really awesome review. So I really appreciate your contributions in that way. And also thanks for what you do with the show, and those contributions are fantastic. So important for our field. So you're doing a great thing. So I'm always happy to be a part of it. So thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.